when you hear Ben Wallace, who I heard this morning, coming out on the news rounds, saying that NATO is a defensive alliance, this is the line that's always trotted out. The NATO is a defensive alliance, which it may well be. It may be the same exact defensive alliance that actually attacked Belgrade, the Serbians, in 1998 to protect Kosovans. Now, I'm not saying that that was the wrong thing to do. Quite the contrary. I applaud NATO for taking that action. I was foursquare behind it. But to say that it's a defensive alliance, who decides what's defensive and what's offensive? It also took part in actions in Afghanistan post 9/11. Again, I don't disagree with that. Quite the contrary. I was fully supportive of those actions because an egregious act had occurred on 9/11, and I think a response was absolutely merited and warranted. But would you say that it was defensive or offensive? I mean, you could make the same argument with Osama bin Laden about when you choose defense or offense. It lies in the eyes of the beholder, does it not? So I think this argument that NATO is purely a defensive alliance does not stand up to scrutiny at all. And if I'm a foreign policy realist, and Keir Giles there says that this is now falling out of fashion, I tell you this, I have actually read international relations, so I know a few things about foreign policy, and I follow it very, very closely. And I think Henry Kissinger, quite frankly, would completely disagree with Keir Giles, and so would I. I think that we have lost our marbles in the West when it comes to actually dealing with concepts like the balance of power, spheres of influence, that you don't go around hanging around on the borders of a nuclear-armed state. Whatever you think of the person, and I'm not a Vladimir Putin fan at all, I can tell you. So before anyone says that I'm a Putin apologist, a la Nigel Farage, please just stop. Please just stop and engage your brain, and let's have a proper discussion about this like mature adults. And actually, we can disagree. Maybe agree to disagree. I'm no fan of Vladimir Putin. I'm no fan of someone who condemns and vilifies and subjugates any form of people against him in his own country, a la Alexei Navalny. I don't respect someone like that, nor do I applaud them. All I'm saying is, from a foreign policy point of view, I think this was remiss on the part of the EU and NATO. I think they overextended, and I don't think they provoked Russia. I wouldn't use that language, but I certainly don't think it helped. What is your view? Did the West provoke Russia into war with Ukraine?
I don't agree with Nigel Farage or his party. I'm totally against.
No, that's fine, of course. But just in terms of the substance of the point, forget about the party politics of it. We're discussing the substance, and I think you've got a very strong view, and I understand why. What do you say to James Cleverly, who said that Mr. Farage was echoing Putin's vile justification for the brutal invasion of Ukraine? And there are many others. John Healey, Labour's Shadow Defence Secretary, said this: "These are disgraceful comments which reveal the true face of Nigel Farage, a Putin apologist who should never be trusted with our nation's security." I mean, do you think, David, that this is just turning into let's all bash Farage rather than deal with the substance of what he's saying here?
Well, let's all bash Putin, because I don't agree with Putin. I'm not a supporter of Putin, but this is Russia. The ordinary people of Russia have learned from the experience after Nazi and Western invasion of Russia, killing 27 million Russians. They are well aware of the West's attacks on Russia. It's been going on for centuries. And this is the last one. They are not going to put up with it any longer.
David,
Putin is only a reflection of what ordinary. And I have friends in Ukraine and in Russia who are also friends amongst themselves. But this is a direct attack on Russia from the United States and the West. It's only like you said earlier on, when the Russians put nuclear armaments in Cuba, the Americans didn't put up for it for a moment.
Well, I couldn't honestly. This is where I think that people who come out with this complete drivel need to actually answer the question of exactly if this happened on the borders. If this happened in Mexico, would the US put up with this for a second? The answer to that, I think, is quite clear.
Finland and Sweden adopted a position of neutrality for a long time, and nobody came out with the same vitriol about that.
Go on, explain your point.
Well, since the Second World War, both those countries adopted a process of not joining the EU and not being in NATO because they thought that it would make their relationships with Russia more difficult. And that was explicitly stated.
And now they've both gone the other way after the invasion of Ukraine. Are you actually saying that Russia has undermined? What's your point? Is that Russia's undermined its own position with those two states? Is that the point?
No, my point is that neutrality worked for 78 years.
Right.
And that, we don't know what's going to happen now, but it was certainly considered to be a sensible and rational policy, which was not criticised in the West for those significantly for those 78 years, and was a model of a way of adopting neutrality. I also think that there was obviously some degree of collaboration, and they both have highly successful militaries and protection, and that is an avenue that could have been considered for Ukraine, and they're also very independent and democratic countries.
Why do you think, Graham, that was not considered for Ukraine? Because quite honestly, if it was, Putin himself had hinted at that would have been acceptable to him if it was neutral. What he did not want, and what he could not fathom, is either Ukraine joining the EU or joining NATO. If it was neutral, if there was some neutral status that had been agreed by all parties around it, and if the West had been very clear to Ukraine that, look, we understand you want to join NATO for your own security. We're not going to have that because we do not want to risk upsetting a nuclear armed power on the borders of Europe, on the eastern flank of Europe. Some arrangement could have been reached, could it not, Greg?
Well, I think so. Arrangements were tried to make, I think, very naively by NATO, in that they were going to use Russian tank carriers in 2002. And I thought then and think now, whoa, this is a bit too soon. We don't know how stable Russia is, and we don't necessarily want to be terribly integrated with what they're doing. So I think there's generally been, in both directions, a complete degree of naivety and a lack of understanding of the position of Russia and the nature of Russia's thinking, and that it is all happened far too quickly and naively, and despite the great intellects in the diplomatic service who are rarely on. Almost always we have military people. Very rarely there are former diplomats who come on to discuss the issue, even though usually their academic qualifications are far superior.
There's so much black and white around this subject that, if you take the point of view that you are raising this morning, you are an apologist for Putin. Right. You love Nigel Farage and the Reform Party. You're a fascist or whatever. Yep. And you can't have the view that you have and still agree with a lot of what the West is saying. And I think that Nigel Farage has a lot of truth in what he says. In fact, even before the war started, ad nauseum, LBC had Lord Bannett, who used to be the head of the armed forces of the UK, who said many times he is sure that the West are reassuring Putin behind the scenes that NATO will never allow Ukraine to be accepted in their club.
They did for years. It's been documented by former British ambassador, for heaven's sake.
Exactly. And Gorbachev was concerned about Ukraine. Yeltsin was concerned about, and your point you made about John Major, that's everywhere to see. There's so many documents, and the problem is you have people. It's like with the COVID, as somebody who said, you can always get a doctor or you can always get an expert to come to one point of view, and you can get anybody on to say, "Oh, it's all Russian propaganda." It's not, and I think that NATO were very foolish. I think that Trump, and I don't like him. I don't think this war would have happened if Trump would have been president. I think he would have made clear to Putin he will never allow Ukraine to join NATO, because it's all very well you've got a caller before saying, they're...
Yeah, what do you say to Jason, though? Jason was making a good point, though, James, to be fair, right? He was saying, hang on a second, right? These are independent sovereign states. They can do what they want. Some of them were part of the USSR. They want to run away as quickly as possible, and the quickest way of protecting themselves is to join a military defensive alliance. What's wrong with that?
Sure. Anybody can. They're entitled. They're free to talk to NATO, but at the same time, NATO is free to say to Ukraine, "Listen, Mr. President, we would love you to join us, but it is not actually conducive to peace in the region." Absolutely. And I think that's the irony.
That is the irony.
NATO's supposed to be this peace organization that prevents war, and I think, in fact, it is ironically caused the war by not being a little bit sensible.
Thank you, James. I think it's a very powerful point.
No, absolutely not did the EU or NATO have anything to do with Vladimir Putin invading the Ukraine. In exactly the same way, the EU and NATO were not to blame when Putin's war in Chechnya or Putin's war in Georgia. The fact is, Vladimir Putin actually had a sovereign nation as a buffer between Poland, which is a member of the EU and a member of NATO. He had that buffer. If he takes the Ukraine in his land grab, and he's successful with that, he will be bordering a NATO and EU member state.
Jason, you're sorry, on that one, I've got to pick you up. The whole entire reason why, or one of the reasons that was given was the West was consistently flirting with Ukraine on NATO membership and has been doing so since 2008.
No, we have to disagree because...
No, but it's true. It's nothing to disagree,
NATO,
Jason.
No. Wait. You're completely misunderstanding that because NATO and the European Union are both voluntary membership states. You have to apply as a sovereign, independent nation in order to be accepted as a member. It's not like the EU. Everyone knows what the EU exists, right? Everybody knows it's out there. Everybody knows that NATO is out there. If a particular country in the territory says, look, I'm really interested in becoming a member of your club, then of course the club's going to talk to them. That is not provoking a third member, a third country, a third sovereign nation to say, hang on, we're provoking you now because we're talking to XYZ over there.
Are you actually being serious, Jason? I mean, just step back for a second. Just step back for a second and look at this way. If Mexico wanted to join a so-called defensive pro-Russian alliance, right, do you think the US would stand for that for a minute?
Mexico and the United States are part of the North American Trade Agreement, right? So is Canada. So that is extremely unlikely to happen. The fact
it
is,
happened in Cuba in 1962.
That's true. And also Trump had disbanded it and then rebuilt it, and it's just a mess over there. Mm-hmm. But the point being, you cannot invade another state because you're afraid that they're talking to somebody else. That's
I agree with you.
The whole point of sovereignty. Do you not agree with sovereignty?
I completely agree with you that you cannot go around invading other states. Absolutely agree. I do not, for one moment, agree that Vladimir Putin should have gone into another state. Absolutely not. However, do I think that NATO and the West was remiss in expanding eastwards? Yes, I do. Absolutely. That is not the same thing. It is not the same thing saying that they gave a green light to Putin to go and inherently be expansionist and go and invade another state. It's two separate things, and we should be able to hold two separate ideas in our heads. So do I think that the West was sensible? Absolutely not.
Roll back a second, Ali. Roll back a second. So on the same token, do you think that the Soviet Union was wrong to go around land grabbing all the neighbouring countries to Russia?
I think any land grabbing is completely wrong, including colonial Britain land grabbing as well. I think any land grabbing of any kind is wrong and should be resisted. I also think, Jason, just on this point, I also think international law should be respected and people shouldn't go around invading sovereign states, including like going into Iraq on false premises. I also think that.
I agree with you on that.
There you go.
However, if the Soviet Union's expansion was something that you oppose, then you have to have some kind of defense organization to stop the Soviet Union continuing to expand, especially when the countries around, like Georgia, Chechnya, Ukraine, they all wanted to leave. They did not want to be a part of the Soviet Union.
Now, that's a good point.
They were unable to do it by themselves.
No, that is a very good point, and I'm glad you've raised it because the argument, and you've made it in a very measured way, Jason, so thank you.